having somebody who can say, oh, I know that person, or I'm from that district. So there's a lot of reasons to make the show of strength and to keep and actually put all the work in, but that a coalition will bring a big range of assets and relationships that no one person and even any one organization is not going to have on their own.
All right, so I'm going to hold off on my other question, and I want to see if there's any audience questions at this point for our wonderful panelists.
What's your next dialogue? For coffee? Your coffee date?
Saturday.
Is it open?
Yeah, it's always the first Saturday of the month.
No, I'm not going to spill anything on it.
I love how you didn't worry about it. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
fine.
I mean, it's.
Where is it?
Yeah, it's technically for my constituents. Well then, yes, it's generally at the Hollywood Senior Center, which is in the Hollywood area, and then or it's here. I alternate between the two locations, mainly there. 9 o'clock.
Sure. I'm a cop watcher, and one of my big problems is when I'm out filming the police, I'll be standing like on a property like Lloyd Center or something like that that's not publicly owned but privately owned, but it's accessible to everyone, like Fred Meyer's. And the police will go in and tell the management, tell me that I have trespassed from the property and all I'm doing is filming. And I was wondering if there would be ways of changing that law so that the people that are filming or taking pictures or videos or whatever cannot just arbitrarily be trespassed because of what they're doing.
Do you know anything about that?
I don't, but I imagine if you're in private property, there's not.
Yeah. I think that.
Keeping constitutional law. Michael Sunlighter here. This is not, but in terms of response, there are Supreme Court cases involving Lloyd Center. You can look them up. And the Supreme Court did rule in one case that a shopping mall like Lloyd Center is the modern day equivalent of the town center and has the same free speech provisions protected as a traditional town center, presumably that would include filming. That is not necessarily within the business, but outside of the businesses, in the mall itself, may very well be a case that the ACLU would be concerned about.
Yeah, phone a friend. So we are almost at time. I think we have one more question, and then we're going to transition to the town hall portion of the event.
Hi, years ago I was involved in legislative advocacy in California, and one of the things that I noticed was that there were a couple of public interest lobbying groups, and there were dozens and dozens and dozens of banks, insurance companies, private interests that were shaping policy in the state of California because they had the money. And I'm just curious, I mean, I hear about niceness and respect and all that, but is it too cynical to say that things are largely shaped by powerful interests, like money interests? Is that accurate, or is it not the case in Oregon?
You know, I would say that the money interests, you know, definitely find a way to make their voices heard, right? And you know, it depends how you refer to moneyed interests, right? I mean, I do believe that the most effective advocacy comes, well, for me anyway, comes when, you know, I'm hearing from a lot of people. And, you know, certain business associations are able to turn out a lot of business owners, you know, a lot of farmers, et cetera, who can be very, you know, very, very effective. But, you know, I believe, at least, you know, from what I've seen here in Oregon, at least in recent years, you know, people power really does make a difference. And I think there are some really great organizations, you know, like the Coalition of Communities of Color. They're doing a great job of giving voice to people who have not really figured out a way to have their voices heard. But they are being increasingly heard, I think, and I just really encourage that.
There's efforts underway to come up with a democracy agenda, small donor elections, and setting a cap, a contribution cap, and I think those are efforts that I'm already fully supportive of, but I think that will level the playing field. Unfortunately, under Citizens United and in our Oregon Constitution, money does have influence because it's speech in many ways. It's also privileged access. If you could afford many lobbyists to be in our ears and doing research and finding other ways to make arguments that may not involve campaign contributions, but it may involve how loud they are. And in that sense, they could have influence over policy and legislation. But as Senator Benbrow said, there is people power. And if you look at spending for the ballot measures this time around and how I think our opposition for the Democratic Party was no supermajority, and they spent money to try to do that, and we still, even though we didn't necessarily campaign on let's get a supermajority, we still ended up doing that because people power, people organize and collectively turn out, and I think that still has influence, but there's definitely still room for us to change our system to make it more fair for everybody.
I think exactly, the people are the most powerful interest, and it is hard. There are some big fights that we've had, but there have also really been some big victories. Even something like minimum wage, I mean, that definitely, that had opposition and will be coming back. Organizations will be coming back on tenant protections, paid family leave, clean energy jobs. So all of these issues, they are challenging, but there are so many community members as well as community-based organizations who will be there doing it. And we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't believe and honestly see a path to victory. And it may not pass in one session, but it is absolutely possible to, I think, get there when we do organize effectively. And I think just reflecting Representative Hernandez's statement on the elections, I think that should be heartening. There was a lot of money on some ballot measures, but Oregonians really stood up and didn't listen. That's so I hope that our legislators will also be encouraged by the election results to work for the interests of the people.
And let me just say, Elizabeth, that so you're all here because you want to advocate for something. But we also need you at times to advocate against things, right? Among those 2,800 bills that are introduced, there are some really awful things. And I'd like to think that they're not going to get very far, but some of them, they may be very dangerous, but they seem kind of innocuous. And, if there's an issue area that you're really following, it would really be helpful for us if you see something out there that we need to be warned against, because that is also an important part of what we have to do.
Can we have a round of applause for our... So if folks have additional questions about the process, I'm going to be around, members of my team will be around, our panelists, if they have a couple minutes, may stick around. But we're going to turn things over to the town hall portion of this event, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Commissioner Fritz.
First of all, thank you very much, members. I know I learned a lot. How many of you are at the legislative town hall for the first time? Fabulous, thank you for coming. And how many of you have never been to any city council events before? All right, well that's great, thank you for being here. Now, if you want to come to join me, could I have both the mayor's staff and my staff join me just for 1 minute? Elizabeth mentioned that one of the cardinal rules when lobbying the legislature is don't disdain the staff, or in other words, respect the staff. They do a lot of the work. And so we wanted to just briefly introduce you to our staff, because they're going to be the people that you're most likely going to talk to if you talk to City Hall or if you want to meet with us. So these are actually the women who helped me put on this forum, so I just wanted you to see them and thank them for all the work that they've done. So they're going to give you their name and what they do and the job that they had immediately prior to the one with my office.
Good evening. My name is Claire Adamsick. I'm a senior policy advisor for Commissioner Fritz. I work as the liaison currently to the Office of Equity and Human Rights. I also work on land use and planning issues, livability, houselessness, and assorted others. And I was immediately before this, 4 years ago, I worked at the Northeast Coalition of Neighborhoods.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Cynthia Castro, and I'm a policy advisor for Commissioner Fritz. Some of the things that I work on include housing, police, sustainability, and parks. And before joining her office, I actually worked for Parks and Rec for about 4.5 years, most recently as the director of the Charles Jordan Community Center in North Portland.
Good evening, I'm Christina Nieves, Policy Advisor with Commissioner Fritz's team, and I'm actually the liaison to the Water Bureau. Formerly before that was one of the liaisons to the Parks Bureau. I also work on open and accountable elections. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but it is our public campaign financing program, very important. One of our top priorities. And before that, I worked as a policy assistant at Multnomah County.
Good evening. My name is Yesenia Carrillo. I am a Constituent Services Specialist in the Office of Commissioner Fritz. Prior to this role, I was a paralegal at a nonprofit immigration law firm.
Good evening. My name is Nissan Kwan, and I'm the Commissioner's Executive Assistant and Lead Staff Member for Environmental Issues, Government Relations, and Transportation. Immediately before this, I was a Legislative Assistant during the 2018 short session for State Senator Rob Wagner.
So if you need help in my office, your best bet is to try to contact one of my staff first, because they're going to be able to give your issue the time and attention that it deserves, and you can actually then just tell them what to do.
I'm Michelle Planbeck. I'm the Mayor's Legislative Director. Most recently, I worked at the county as an assistant to former Commissioner Judy Shiprath. But it would be remiss for me not to mention that I also worked for Representative and Representative now Senator Deborah for 2 years, 2011 and 2010.
Thank you very much for getting to know our staff, because that also helps you get stuff done. I'm going to turn it over to Claire, who's going to set up the rest of the... And the mayor and I are going to sit here and listen.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we've got the agenda for the rest of the evening. Cover some ground rules really quickly, and then spend the most time getting your input. We'll also have a sort of dot voting priority setting exercise near the very end, and then we will wrap up. So I will go through these pieces as quickly as possible so that the most time can be for your questions and your input. For ground rules, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, just very quickly, maintaining a respectful space and avoiding interruptions, listening with respect, keeping your questions or your comments within the time. I think Elizabeth has graciously volunteered to help be timekeeper for that, so we'll have a little, don't be alarmed, there's going to be a little buzzer noise, kind of if you've been in City Hall before, something like that. Doesn't sound quite the same. If you agree or disagree, if we can ask that you either kind of thumbs up or thumbs down or wave jazz hands to show support, just so we can kind of keep things flowing. You're welcome to do that if you want to share that. And just appreciating the diverse perspectives in the room. Thanks again. We have a great turnout tonight, and we're not here to necessarily build consensus. It's really to just hear from as many perspectives as possible. So, next slide, please. And these are listed also over on the, so Wisan and Christina are going to be scribing your input for voting purposes later. We also have priority themes and policy position themes. And in short, the difference between the two is the priorities is where the city will be putting, the bulk of its time and energy, where for policy positions, there are areas that the city will be supporting and be also supporting.
And if I might just interrupt for 1 second. We're close to the end of setting the legislative agenda for the 2019 session. Obviously, 2019 is going to be upon us very quickly. So these things that are listed up here are things that the city already knows that these are going to be prioritised. What we're asking from you tonight is which of these do you particularly support or oppose, and also what's missing. What other suggestions do you have for either action at the state or at the federal government that we should consider adding to this list?
Thank you.